If I were you, I would have a Bible. Isaiah 53. I look forward to these weekly moments. I really do. I look forward to sharing the word with you. I look forward to worshiping with you. I look forward to the connection, the community, the mutual support, the upbuilding. All of it. It's good. It was good when they said, "Let us go to the house of the Lord," the psalmist said. There's something good about this. It's life-giving. You know what, gang? Sermon before the sermon, and I've already preached one. I'll preach a second one before I even start. Life is full of life-draining things. It just is. Things that occupy our time, our attention, and they have to be done, but they're not necessarily invigorating. I don't do the dishes and get inspired for life and living. I mean, let's be honest. I don't clean out. I put a crib together yesterday. If there was 165 parts to this thing, I have no idea why. It's holding an 18-pound child. It wasn't life-giving, but there are life-giving things that when we make time for them, we're the better for them. And I believe this is one of them. Isaiah 53, the 53rd chapter of the book of Isaiah, is one of the most remarkable examples of prophecy in the entirety of the Word. Penned about 700 years before the birth of Christ, Isaiah speaks to the life of Christ in absolutely amazing detail. As one author notes, this section of Isaiah contains inarguable, incontrovertible proof that God is the author of Scripture and Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy. The details are so minute that no human could have predicted them by accident, and no impostor fulfilled them by cunning. The prophecy in its totality speaks to the following: Jesus' substitutionary death, his burial, his resurrection, his saving of sinners, his intercession, his kingdom, and beyond. And the chapter is short enough that I want to read it in its entirety. It's only about 12 or so verses. So let's give the word the best of our attention. As we read, I want you to think of what you know from the gospel accounts. And I want you to consider that this was written 7 centuries before the events even took place. That's incredible. Isaiah begins in verse 1 of chapter 53. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Verse 4, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers, it's silent. So he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Verse 10. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, verse 12, and we'll conclude with this piece, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. And all I can say to that is wow. Because when you have a background and an understanding of the gospel accounts and who and what Jesus was and what he did, that's amazing detail, minute details, as the commentator said, regarding Christ and the life that he lived in fulfillment of prophecy. But in the midst of this amazing 12-verse long prophecy, I want to focus on one small, very easy to overlook segment this morning that has captivated me in the last couple of weeks. And it's the second part of verse 2. Isaiah 53, the second part of verse 2, he, speaking of Jesus, had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. I'm going to read it one more time. We're going to focus on this the entirety of the morning. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Well, what does this mean? I want to begin to unpack this prophetic utterance a bit. It means that there was nothing about Christ at his first coming that in a sense drew the world to him. The text isn't referring, I believe, to physical beauty or attractiveness in a sense. Rather, there was nothing about Jesus that a person with a worldly perspective would have found appealing. As one author notes, the Christ would arise in lowly conditions and wear none of the usual emblems of royalty, making his true identity visible only to the discerning eye of faith. From a worldly point of view, Jesus would not have been deemed great or a person of consequence. He did not possess those characteristics normally associated with what we will deem earthly greatness. And I want to spend a few minutes with you identifying maybe 3, 4, or 5 areas that Jesus lacked that normally will connect a person to greatness. Number 1, wealth. Consider the greatness in our world is often intimately connected with the size of one's bank account. To be great in this world is to be a person of wealth and means. Consider, for instance, the people who occupy in our culture what we will call celebrity status. The one common connection with these elite figures is not looks, it's not skill, and it's certainly not positive social impact. Rather, it's how much cash they have. But this can't be said about Jesus. In fact, the reverse is quite true. And I want to make this statement deliberately. Despite the claims of celebrity pastors who live celebrity lifestyles off of Jesus' name, Christ himself was not wealthy by any earthly metric. Think about that for a moment. He was raised in relative poverty, being reared in the home of a lowly and humble carpenter. His later ministry was not marked with financial abundance. I want you to consider the words of Jesus. Don't turn there, but I want you to hear what he has to say in Luke 9 if you want the reference. Verse 58. Foxes have dens, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. When this night's over, you likely know where you're going to sleep, correct? You have a home, and bless the Lord for that. That's a good thing. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with money, wealth, means, and beyond. But we've raised it to a place of idolatry in our culture. And if Jesus was around today, the great of the world would not consider him great because he didn't have the bank account to go with it. We have a home to go to. We have a bed, in a sense, that we will lay our heads upon tonight and bless the Lord for good sleep. And many of us could use a good night's sleep, especially if you have a baby in the house. But Christ couldn't say that. He had to trust every day of his ministry. Where am I going to spend the night, Father? And the Father always made provision. But he could lay no claim to, I have a home where I can absolutely go and it's mine. In fact, the only true possession of Christ, in a sense, was his garment or cloak, and even that was stripped from him at his crucifixion, becoming the property of a soldier who cast the best lot. He was familiar with lack, normally not a hallmark of those who are deemed great. Number 2, besides wealth, let's talk about education. Consider the greatness in our world is often connected to having the right degree. Or at least we've convinced an entire generation of young people about that truth. Now, please hear me clearly. Pastor is not against money, and pastor is by no means against education. I'm educated myself. I value education. It opens doors in certain fields. We as a nation esteem the great universities in the lofty seats of learning in our nation. We say things like Harvard and Yale and MIT, and automatically images of greatness and geniuses and brilliance come to mind. We elevate their professors and the brain trusts, in a sense, that they produce. Many of the great associated with academia enjoy the rarefied air of academia and the culture that has come to grow around it. But Jesus was not great by this metric either. Now, I am not saying he was uneducated, quite the inverse. Likely he received an education at home or from a local religious leader attached to the local synagogue. But it was only a poor man's education. As the scribes of his day said with contempt, he had never learned. In other words, he wasn't college bred like they were. Now, I want to affirm what one author notes. The love of knowledge was awake early within Jesus. He daily knew the joy of deep and happy thought. He had the best of all the keys to knowledge, the open mind and the loving heart, and the three great books lay ever open before him: the Bible, man, and nature. And though he was the greatest teacher to ever walk this earth, and he is the fount of knowledge and wisdom itself, he was despised in his earthly life and ministry because he didn't have the academic pedigree. Number 3, parentage. Consider the greatness in our world is often tied to being born into the right family, having the right parents, the right family pedigree. Gang, let's face it, being born into a family with the last name Kennedy, Gates, Clinton, Buffett, and beyond confers on one a level of earthly esteem that is not necessarily associated with the names Foley, McAuliffe, Rice, or beyond. See what I'm saying there? Is that absolutely true? You say the word Kennedy, it's a very different response than the name Noel. No offense to the Knowles, I put myself in that same category, Bubba. Often the great are deemed great because of the circumstances of their family at birth. But Jesus, again, could not claim such a pedigree. Now, this is interesting because Jesus did have royal blood flowing through his veins in a human and in a divine sense. Being the divine Son of God, he certainly, if you want to use the term, had spiritual DNA that is equal with God the Father's. And in a human sense, he had royal ties all the way back to King David. But by his time, almost 1,000 years after that dynasty, that name, that lineage was long bereft and emptied of power and wealth and beyond. He would have been deemed little more than the potentially illegitimate son of a carpenter by the esteemed and the great of his age. And also consider the place of his upbringing. We know he was born in Bethlehem, but help the pastor out. Where was Jesus raised in his youth? Nazareth. And what did one of his own apostles go on to say about Nazareth? Nazareth, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It was a notoriously wicked town that was overrun by sin and a bad name. To put it this way, he was born on the wrong side of the tracks. Jesus was not born into the proverbial New York City or LA or Tokyo or London. I'm going to say this lovingly, but it's absolutely true. He was born into the Worcesters or the Fitchburgs or the Barrys of the world. Don't be offended by that. But Barry, like Worcester, is not a New York City, a place of high worldly esteem, though we esteem it greatly, living here and beyond. Jesus could not claim greatness by birthright. Number 4, moving very quickly. Jesus didn't have the right social connections. Consider that greatness in our world is often connected to your network. Much of being great has to do with knowing the right people. Ever hear the phrase, it's all about who you know? Find your way into the in crowd, buddy up to those who are great, and the world will likely deem you great simply by association. This cannot be said of Jesus. Now, there were great people, air quotes, in his day. You had the Pharisees, who were esteemed as being wonderful and amazing and scholarly religious leaders. You had the Sadducees, you had the scribes, you had the teachers of the law, you had governing powers like King Herod and Pilate. But Jesus found a way to alienate, offend, and tick off every single one of those groups. He didn't try to buddy up and get into the in crowd. In fact, quite the opposite. He called these people, if you want to do the research, go through the Gospels. He called them hypocrites. By the way, can the pastor make a quick side note? We need to get back to a biblical understanding of what the word hypocrite means. It is not a person who says one thing and does another. If that were the case, we're all hypocrites. But it's a specific type of sin. It has to do with somebody who puts on a show and a pretense, but the way that they live externally does not match up with what's going on in their heart. Different story for a different time. He called them hypocrites. He called them children of hell, children of the devil. This is warm, fuzzy Jesus, by the way. This is milquetoast Jesus, who loved everybody and called us all to sing Kumbaya. Hypocrites, children of hell, children of the devil, blind guides, fools. My personal favorite, whitewashed tombs full of death, uncleanness, and dead men's bones. He called them snakes and vipers and foxes and more. Even worse, to make matters worse, Jesus surrounded himself with the lowly, the humble, the poor, the sinful, the hopelessly ruined, the demonically possessed, the shamed, the outcast, and the other kinds of people not even we would invite to dinner parties. And the esteemed of his age hated him for it. This man eats with tax collectors and sinners, to which Jesus replied, I haven't come to call the healthy or the righteous to repentance. I've come for the sick. Now again, when Jesus meets an outcast or he meets a broken person, he doesn't leave them in that condition. But still, those are the people he surrounded himself with. Consider the 12 people that he chose. Gang, they were not great by any earthly means. You wouldn't hire Simon Peter to walk your dog. But when you get to heaven one day, the new heavens and the new earth, you're going to see the foundation named after that man, Peter. I wouldn't hire Levi either. And I certainly wouldn't hire James and John. They want to call fire down on me all the time. Sons of thunder. Jesus had connection with his Father and with the masses, out of whom came the apostles, but the great of the world did not esteem him. Final point in terms of what Jesus lacked, and you got to hear me out on this point because it's going to sound contradictory at first. Jesus did not have authority, earthly authority. Consider the greatness in our world is often tied to the scope of your authority. Much of being great has to do with wielding power over others. It might be on the job site. Everybody's vying for the corner office. It might be in the political realm. If you genuinely believe that most of the people in the upper crust of government really think about the little person, I don't know. I'm not convinced. Do I pray for them? Yes. Do I believe that their intentions are noble in a sense? Not necessarily. I think a lot of it has to do with power. In the military, it's about who has the highest rank. In a despotic, broken nation, who has the biggest army and the most firearms. But the great of the world are often deemed with those who have the most power. Now, Jesus possessed authority. He's the creator of the ends of the earth. He's God. I mean, he has that advantage. According to Colossians 1, he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven, on earth, visible, invisible, thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And certainly when you look at his miracles, he demonstrated profound authority over the realm of nature, sickness, demons, death itself, and beyond. What do you think the miracles were but a demonstration of his authority? But the great of the world were never swayed by the miracles. Jesus would cleanse lepers. He would raise the dead. He would multiply food. And they would say, Jesus, give us another sign, just one more sign that you truly are who you say you are. How hard-hearted do you have to be to see a person do what he did and then walk away saying, I need one more sign to convince me. And the only sign he would go on to give them was his death and resurrection, by the way. To these people, Jesus was little more than a traveling teacher, the poor son of a carpenter. He had no office. He had no throne. He had no actual army. He had no authority. And even though he was, is, and shall be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the world has never recognized who and what he is. Like we said in verse 2, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Now, if you look at your bulletin or if you look at the screen, go forward one, Taryn. The name of this sermon is Considering Christ at Christmas. So you're probably wondering, Pastor, where in the world is the tie to Christmas? It says in the bulletin on the screen that this is about Christmas, so here we go. All of the sentiments shared this morning bring us back in many ways to realities evident in the birth of Jesus Christ. In other words, his apparent lack of earthly greatness is evident in every facet of the Christmas story. Jesus was not born into money or wealth. Do you think that Mary and Joseph had piles and bags of cash? No. In fact, when they went into Jerusalem to dedicate him, in accordance and in fulfillment of the law, what was required of them, the offering that they offered in compliance with Old Testament law, the parts that we kind of skip over because it's boring and dry reading, it evidenced the fact that they didn't have any money because they offered the gift or the offering that was tied to the people who really couldn't afford the bigger and the better sacrifices. Jesus was not born into a position of academic or parental privilege. He was born into the home of the simple, the hardworking, and I use this term carefully but purposefully. He was born into a world of peasants who would have found absolutely no favor by the elite of their day. They couldn't even get a room at the inn on the night of his birth. He was not born into a family with a throne or authority. The King of the universe was born into obscurity very far from the seat of any earthly power. He was not born into a position of connection. The great of the earth did not rally around him at his birth. His entrance into the world went exceptionally unnoticed, except for a few lowly shepherds who just happened to be in the right field at the right time. Now, of course, Magi would come a few years after his birth, but that was a very, very, very small percentage of the great of their age, and they weren't even from among his own people. When one of the great figures, Herod, heard of the news of the king's birth, he decided, let's not worship him, let's try to kill him. And as a measure to ensure my success and the ongoing nature of my throne, I'm going to kill every boy 2 and under, just to make sure I get him, which he didn't, of course, by the way. The leaders of religion at the time who heard the report of the Magi regarding the birth of the king, that they had waited for almost 1,000 years, could not be bothered to even go make the pilgrimage to see where he was. Again, he had no beauty. He had no majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. I want to close with this, and I'm closing a few minutes early. So my advice when you head downstairs is if Ginger's in the midst of her teaching still, let her finish up with the children. But there's 2 things that I want to close with. And the first one has to do with us, and the second one has to do with Christmas. Can I step on all of our toes for a second? I got one? Okay. Let's try that. Can I step on all of our toes for a second? Here we go. To what degree are you chasing wealth, power, connections, and a good name among men more than you are chasing hard after the kingdom and his righteousness? Though there's nothing wrong with these things in themselves, I want you to hear me very clearly because I have seen and I see believers derail spiritually. These things are treacherous to enslave even the most well-intentioned. C.S. Lewis has a great line that the best things make the worst idols. And he has the line that Satan wasn't made out of a mouse that fell, but an archangel. the more noble, the more virtuous, the more godly a thing is when it goes south and it's not properly prioritized, it becomes the most demonic thing. Many of you are parents, and that's a wonderful thing. Children are a gift from the Lord, the Bible says, and many of you are absolutely blessed with the kids that God has given you. But can I challenge you with the thought, don't love them more than you love the one who gave them to you. I see so many parents compromise biblical principles for the sake of their children. And let me just tell you, when the Lord saw Abraham's heart was a little too close to Isaac, what did he ask the Lord? What did the Lord ask Abraham to do? Oh, that's a tough story. Let's be honest. Pastor, I can't make it to church for the next 3 months because my kid has football. That is ridiculous to me. That has never, if you said that, I'm not trying to be offensive to you personally. That has never made sense to me. And when your kid is 25 and wants nothing to do with God, you won't remember that the seeds were planted to deprioritize church way back when. Ouch. God has given us jobs, means to provide for our families. And I'm thankful for the growth that I've seen in this area in recent months, because many of the men are really seeking the Lord hard on this principle. Don't let your job become an idol. Don't let it own you. Don't let it become a priority more important than the Lord and his ways, in the execution of his ways. Pastor, I'm working really hard to provide for my family. They need you more than the bank check or the cash that you provide. But Pastor, they have to eat. Yeah, they do. But they need a 5,000 square foot home in 3 new cars, in 3 or 4 new iPhone X's. What I'm saying is we need to really evaluate how much time we put into sustaining things that God hasn't called us to sustain at all. I think the day is going to come in our nation, and I think God is going to allow it for a very good purpose, where the church is going to have to really decide where its allegiances are. And I think that's going to be actually a great day for the Church of Jesus Christ, though a very painful one. You see, I'm a firm believer that God is continually calling us to unbind ourselves from the things of this world in biblical principle. Don't get weird, but ask the questions. And if we won't do it, he might just step up and do it for us. Is that a popular message this morning? No. But the Church of Jesus Christ is literally withering because we're too tied to these things. Consider what idols you have in your life. What dominates your time? What dominates your interest? What dominates your heart? To what does your heart belong? And gang, it is an ongoing assessment to assure that it is Jesus Christ in him alone. To what degree are we chasing, again, wealth and power and connections and a good name among men, more than we are chasing hard after the kingdom and his righteousness? Though there's nothing wrong with these things in their place, they are treacherous in their capacity to enslave, not just the lost, but those who are found. Again, the best things make the worst idols. In the words of Jesus, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world? Finish the sentence. But to forfeit his own soul. Be careful. And by the way, if we're going to go deeper, we sang about that earlier, didn't we? We talked about that. If we're going to go deeper, it's going to require us to change. Because you can't go deeper and stay the same. I think of the words of Bob Wise. About a year and a half ago, we were at a prayer meeting to open the new year. Actually, 2 years ago now. And he said it's impossible to draw closer to Jesus and not feel conviction. You can't do it. Because the closer and closer and closer you go to the light, the more it illuminates where stuff really is. You know, there are rooms in my house where we've been putting a lot of time into the house recently. If the lights are off, it looks fine. Anybody relate to that? But I have dimmers. And if you just kind of start to move up, all of a sudden the look of contentment, this looks pretty good. It begins to go to, whoa. It's a mess in here. Misty, we got to fix this. We got to put some time in. And that's kind of how it is with the Lord. You draw closer to him, and he's like, let's talk about your attitude. I don't want to talk about your attitude. Well, if you want to come closer to the light, we're going to have to talk to the attitude. Otherwise, you're going back into the darkness. That's where we have to wrestle with. And finally, I close with this. To what degree do we recognize the reality of who and what Jesus is? We have touched upon the manner in which the world viewed him, and in many ways still views him. There is a great danger in viewing Jesus from a purely worldly point of view. We will miss much if we only look at Jesus through the metrics or the filters of wealth and power and connections and academia and a good name. And the Apostle Paul himself knew this. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. What Paul was saying is when I'm dealing with people in a pastoral and an apostolic sense, I'm not looking at them in terms of just how the world sees them, but as the Lord does. Do you realize that when God looks at you, what he sees might be different than what the people around you see? You might walk by somebody and think they're a nobody, but heaven knows them far more than they know us. Do you think you would have chosen to be Mary, to be the vessel to bring forth the Christ? No. But she had the esteem of heaven. So Paul says we're not going to judge people anymore or look at them through a worldly point of view. And then he says something interesting. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Paul at one point looked at this Jesus, this pretender, this figure, and he discounted him because he didn't fit into the boxes that Saul at the point, would have thought were connected to greatness. Paul realized the error of that, and he began to really undersee as God began to pull back the layers, the majesty and the wonder that once Paul saw it, he was forever captivated, and he was forever in love, and someone as great as Paul was brought to his knees and into a place where God could finally use him. I want that to happen to me to a far greater degree. And I want you to experience that. Maybe you're here, you've been a believer for decades, and that's wonderful. You're going to heaven. High fives all around. But do you want the rest of your time to be more significant than they've been? That's great. Push in. Maybe you're here this morning and you're young. You're new to this thing called Christianity. You come to church because your parents bring them. I'm looking at some of the young people here. Gang, friendly advice from somebody who's halfway home mathematically. Grab a hold of this stuff while you're young and blow past us adults who came a little bit later in life. I would love to go back and know what I know now when I was 12 or 13. Can any of the older saints say amen to that? You would love to go back. But we can't. But we can impart on them the urgency and the necessity and the wonder of who and what Jesus is. If you don't know him here this morning, if you're not walking with him, this is a perfect time to fix that. Don't leave this place unsure of your allegiance to Jesus Christ and his kingdom. Because, gang, I hate to say it, this might be the last Christmas any of us ever see. You never know. Lord forbid. But you never know. Father, we humble ourselves in your mighty presence. Lord, I'm the first to say that I have need of what Jesus offers. On my own, I am broken and a wretch, and I realize it. And God, rather than run from it and hide it and try to bury it or cover it with a mask, I'm confessing it freely that I need Jesus. I've needed him from the moment of my birth. I've needed him from the moment of my new birth. And I need him until I close my eyes in this life. And I'll need him then even more. God, help us all to follow hard after you. To let go of the things that get in the way. To cast aside the sin and the weights that so easily beset us and trip us up. Take us deeper. And God, in this Christmas season, I'm praying for a reevaluation, a spiritual assessment in all of our hearts that would ask the tough questions and that would allow you as our great physician to put your finger on the elements of our hearts that are out of sync with you. Search us out, O God. Ensure that there is right spirits within us. Conform us to the image of Jesus, even if it means removing junk and stripping pieces off of us. Bring us to where you want us to be and help us along the way, relying on your grace and your mercy. Lord, as we prepare to go our separate ways, I do pray your blessing and your favor. We thank you for this holiday season, this Christmas season, the gift of Jesus Christ. Make sure we all receive it this season in the name of the Lord. And everyone says, amen.